So testing the inject function. Before we start with the test, a little bit of context about the inject function itself, why it's there and why we might or why we should actually use it. So as you see here, I have here an address lookup, that's an Angular service, and I'm using the dependency injection via the constructor and via the inject. Both will give me an instance of the HTTP client. Now, what's the difference, or what's the inject function? What is it doing better than the constructor-based one? There are some technical reasons that speak for the inject function. Let's start with those at first. If you look at the TypeScript code here, then you see that the constructor, that the type of the HTTP client is really only a type. So it says here HTTP client, that's the name of the variable, and the type is HTTP client itself, that's the class. And the problem is with this constructor, if it's compiled down to JavaScript, then this part here is missing. So during the runtime, the only thing that Angular sees is the name of this variable, and from there it would have then to find out what class we actually are looking for, which is impossible. And that's why during the compilation, Angular needs to add some metadata to the JavaScript code where the type is still there. Now this is not necessary with the inject function, because if you compile this function, then in JavaScript you will still have the class there. So you don't need to tweak, or you don't need to manipulate the TypeScript compiler in that sense. It's just right away, it's just there, it just works out of the box, so to say. The other technical reason are the decorators. So as we know, we have here decorators in Angular, quite a lot of them, and they are running in an experimental mode, because the decorators, when Angular 2 was released, decorators weren't stable. Now in the meantime, there has been quite a lot of work in terms of decorators, and they are now already becoming standardized, they are becoming stable. But the point is, the class decorators, some others, but not the parameter decorators. So what are parameter decorators? Those are decorators that we find in the parameters of functions of methods. Now the only place, at least to my knowledge, where we use those parameter decorators, which are not standardized at the moment, which have been postponed, are in the constructor. So what you can do here is that you can, for example, say optional, or you can say skip self. So those are these kind of parameter decorators, which, or there is now a risk that those here, the class-based ones, they are standardized. They are now available in TypeScript just without any additional flag, and those are still running under experimental mode. And of course, there is now a risk that we have two different kind of speeds, so that maybe the parameter decorators might have a different behavior once they are standardized, and of course we also don't know when that will be. And with the inject function, we don't have this problem. We don't have there any parameter decorators anymore, because if you want to provide the same options, then you just have here a configuration or an options object literal, and there you have the same things again, the same properties, but not as decorators. So we don't have there the risk that in the standardization process of the parameter decorators, you're encountering any issues. So these are more or less the main technical reasons that speak for the inject function. There are also others. For example, when you have class inheritance, your subcomponents don't have to request all the dependencies for their parents. And when it comes, for example, to the injection tokens, then they are also type safe. So the question, of course, now is, okay, should we now from now on always use the inject function because of these reasons, or can we still stick to the constructor? For quite some time, that was the official statement. Go with the inject function, don't use the constructor anymore. In the meantime, though, it has kind of not shifted, but it's more or less of a balanced view. So what the Angular team's now saying, if you use the constructor and you're happy with it, then stay with it. If you use the inject, then of course it's also fine, because at the moment, standardization process for the parameter decorators has started. And the opinion of the Angular team is that they want to wait what the final outcome will be, and then there will be a final decision if maybe, constructor will be deprecated or somehow, or whatever will happen. We don't know, the future will show. But at the moment, you can stay with constructor if you want as well. So why this video then? Because there are some reasons, there are some use cases in Angular where the inject function can only be used, and then you still have to be able to write tests with it. And that's functions. So we have in Angular router guards and HTTP interceptors that work as functions where the class-based approach is deprecated. And that means that inside of those functions, they can only work with an inject because a function doesn't have a constructor. Now, I don't want to start to talk here about functional components. That's another story, but it is already enough if we say we will focus on the HTTP interceptors and on the functional router guards. So in general, if you use inject, then and you have a class like here, then it's very easy to test that one. So if I want to test here this address lookup, you see what it is doing. It's sending its and get HTTP request. Then it is verifying if the response type, which is an array, if it is empty, then it returns a false. And if it has some values in it, then it returns a true. Now we have here already a start of a test for this async validator. So what you have to do is that you have to configure your testing module via the testbed, because the inject function is only available via the testbed. We can't instantiate classes on our own anymore. There is actually a video which focuses on that particular topic. So if you're interested, check that one out. But we'll continue here. So we need to provide the address async validator. Why do we have to do that? Well, because the address async validator is not provided in root. If it would be provided in root, then we wouldn't have to provide it. What we always have to provide, of course, is the HTTP client. You can do it in two different approaches. You can do it as I have done it here, namely manually provide a mock, or you can, of course, also use the testing module, which comes out of the box from Angular. In this case, I went with a manual mock. What this mock is doing when the get method is called, it is returning an asynchronous observable. That's why we have here a delay, because if we just use an off, that means that we are producing a synchronous observable, and we want to have the asynchronous part, how it is with a real HTTP request. We want to have this also in our test. I decided here to go with a delay. Good. Whenever you have a service that you want to use in your test, then everything you have to do is that you call TestBed.inject. That's not the inject function itself, that's the TestBed.inject function. These are two different functions. You can call it wherever you want in your test. It will instantiate the class, whatever you're requesting here, and you will get an instance of it. So if I say here TestBed.inject async validator, I'm getting here my validator. And it doesn't matter if that service internally is using a constructor or the inject function, it just works. TestBed.inject will always work. Almost always. So what we have to do then is that I say, okay, we have here our validator. We say validate. It expects here a form control. So I say, yeah, that's a value with Domgasse 5, whatever. That's form control. And what I want to do is that I want to map or transform my returning observable into a promise. So I say here last value from, and then I can use the await. So that's the reason why I went with a promise, that I can use my await. And as we know, we are returning here an empty array, which means that this validator should return an error code. We can quickly look it up. So it says here, this should be the error code that we would expect. So I say, okay, expect is valid to equal, put here the error code. I'm going to rerun the test and we see it's working. Good. So again, TestBed.inject is not the inject function, but you want to use it in any test where you have a service you want to instantiate, and regardless if that service is using a constructor or the inject function, the real one, it will always work. So, and now about the harder part. We have here a router guard. This is an API check guard. It is a function, and as you see here, it is calling the inject function as well. And it can only call the inject function. There is no other way because there is no constructor. It's not a class. Now the problem is that the TestBed.inject function will not work here anymore. So if I want to write a test here, let's quickly check what this guard should do. It will send a request out, and then it will, depending of the response, or actually not depending on the response, if something comes back, it is immediately returning here a true. Good. So we have here our test again, TestBed configure testing module, as it was before with the async validator. We have our HTTP client, and then I say, okay, TestBed.inject will not work. I can't inject the guard as a service. So the only thing that I can do is that I can only run the guard. So I say, okay, please run it. And this is already enough to let the test fail. Because what happens now is that inside of the API check guard, it uses the inject. The inject now runs not inside of a TestBed.inject function, as it was before with the address validator. And that's why we are getting now this error code 203, which means we are calling the inject function outside of the injection context. And for those cases, and only for those cases where we can't use the TestBed.inject, we can artificially re-instantiate or provide the injection context on demand. And the function that does this is the runInInjectionContext. So this one expects another function, and here I can then call my API check guard. Now, that check guard, as you see here, the HTTP client again returns an asynchronous observable. So I made it again a little bit harder. But I can now say, okay, I'm going to await here the response. Again, the last value from. And of course, I also need to mark then here this function is asynchronous as well. So here in await. And I can say, const result, and then I can say here I'm expecting that the result to be true. Okay? And now let's rerun the test. The test is working. Good. Again, runInInjectionContext we use for functions which are internally calling the inject, otherwise we use the normal TestBed.inject. One important thing about the asynchronous stuff, because it looks like the injection context also accepts asynchronous functions, which is only partially true. There is a rule for the injection context here. The injection context is only available synchronously. What does this mean? This means that when I call the API check guard, then of course I call it synchronously. So although I say here await last value from, yes, but the initial call to the function is done synchronously. The first command here is executed, which is calling the inject function. That means this is also executed synchronously, and because here we are still in the injection context, we are safe. So the inject function will here return something, will here return the mocked HTTP client. If we would call the inject function here in one of those pipes, then we are not running synchronous code anymore, but we are already in an asynchronous task. And then the inject function will fail again with the same error message that we had before. Yeah. So what you have to remember here is you can run async or asynchronous function inside of the injection context, but the synchronous part of it, only there can you access the inject function. Only then does it work. All right, so that was it already. If you want to learn more, if you want to know more about testing in Angular, then I would highly recommend you to participate in one of our testing workshops. And if you like this video, please give it a like. Also subscribe to my channel. And I would say thanks for watching and see you in the next video. Goodbye.